This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business.
Jehol was like Windsor in 1919, supposing that the Germans had won the war. I have never found the adage "trade follows the flag" more strikingly illustrated than by the fact that the first civilians to enter Jehol on the heels of the Japanese army were 20 lorry loads of Korean girls. At dusk, a drunken Japanese soldier was a common sight, and also an anomalous one, for in China it is extremely rare to see a man drunk in public. Mr. Panther, after 30 years' experience, could remember only 2 occasions on which he had known Chinese the worse for drink. Muttering under my breath the Chinese and Japanese words for beer, I stepped over the threshold, pushed aside a curtain, and found myself in a large, dark, dirty room with an earth floor. Wooden tables stood round the wall, and at these, ministered to by battered-looking girls in what had once been geisha dresses, sat a number of Japanese soldiers, drinking beer and sweating and making a noise. I had no time to observe more than this before I found myself involved in a brawl with one of them. I thrust him no less violently away, and he fell over the end of a bench and sat down backwards. Although the Japanese soldier showed unmistakable signs of disgruntlement, and although he advanced on me in a manner which might be interpreted as menacing, and although I stood my ground, as an Englishman should, hostilities were destined not to be resumed. A Japanese lady of advanced age bobbed up suddenly between us. She addressed the soldier in shrill, angry tones. The soldier stood still and looked sheepish. The soldier began to weep. The old lady took him by the sleeve and led him out into the street. I sat down at a table and succeeded in ordering some beer, of which I now stood in urgent need. It was brought by a Korean girl. I said, with some feeling, "Thank you." The girl smiled. It was a dreadful smile, so completely perfunctory, so flatly denied by her eyes that I felt awkward, as one might in the presence of a corpse. She looked about 17. She had a small, plain face. Her actions were as mechanical as those of a doll set dancing by a penny in a slot. She seemed to me a tragic figure.
This comes from a book written by Peter Fleming, the older brother of Ian Fleming. He spent some time in China before the war and in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, where you can see some of the horrors of Japanese occupation, like the comfort women. In fact, I've done a video almost a year ago of his description of life there, but in this next section, you'll see him observing Japanese troops in training. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Now, in recent months, there has been a little bit of an uptake in this channel, and it's time for me to really spread out online. Maybe you're in a very similar position with your business, but like me, you have very limited experience online. Well, thanks to Squarespace, they make this incredibly easy. In just a few simple clicks, you can set up a website with some fantastic designs, or even connect it to an online shop. There's no back-end stuff to worry about, or out-of-date plugins. Everything just works, and it is designed to make everything ridiculously easy. But even if there are problems, there's always 24/7 support available to see you through any issues. So by the end of the day, you could have a website reporting the news of your hometown, selling your custom-made hats, or anything which you fancy. So head to squarespace.com/Jabzy to save on 10% of your first purchase of a website or domain.
The late governor's name was Tang Yu Lin. A former bandit, he oppressed his people vilely. When the Japanese threatened his province, he announced to the world his unquenchable determination to resist them to the last man and the last round. But he never fought. Tang Yu Lin rode out of Jehol in flight a few hours before the triumphal entry of the Japanese. The townspeople welcomed the invaders unreservedly. A few months later, Tang Yu Lin was in Japanese pay. His palace stood on the outskirts of the city in a magnificent park. a herd of spotted deer, incuriously aloof, nibbled sweet grass on which was stamped the faint oval of a racetrack, where Tan Yu Lin's wives, 8 in number, had been capriciously obliged to take equestrian exercise every morning. A long, low building in a corner of the wall now housed a Japanese sanitary squad. Formerly, it had been the place where Tan Yu Lin manufactured morphine for sale to his army and his subjects. One day, maneuvers were staged for my benefit in the park. Their objective was a pagoda on the top of a steep knoll. It contained a hypothetical machine gun and would, in practice, have been impregnable. They launched the attack pell-mell. Attempts to correlate fire and movement were unscientific to a degree, but their dash was terrifyingly impressive. The men, though acting under perfect discipline, uttered blood-curdling yells as they advanced. The canal, waist deep, was forded as though it had been the final obstacle in a cross-country race, and the ultimate assault on the pagoda was carried out with a deadly seriousness which was as far removed as possible from the spirit of strenuous burlesque which distinguishes the climax of mock warfare in this country, where the British private, coming at last to close quarters, goes all out to make his opponent laugh. The Japanese does his best to freeze the other's blood. It was a most instructive demonstration.
So here he is quite a typical British author of the time, and the ferociousness of Japanese troops can be seen even when it's just a demonstration. As for the Chinese warlord, like many, they just began to accept Japanese rule in exchange for power for themselves. But in this next section, he will march out with the Japanese and their Chinese allies on anti-bandit raids into the countryside, and he will invoke the imagery of D.W. Griffiths, the man who made the film A Birth of a Nation. Now, although many locals did take part in fighting against the Japanese, you will see one very strange way that they were able to resist, by clapping with such vigour that they will frighten the horses of the Japanese.
I stood on the platform of Mukden Station. The scene, outwardly, was a gay one. The Japanese ladies were wearing their best clothes, so were their children. Commemorative fans, specially manufactured for this occasion, fluttered ubiquitously. Another flying column was leaving Mukden on anti-bandit operations. Beside me, a Japanese lady wept silently and with a touching dignity. All up and down the platform, there was a deeper undercurrent of emotion that seemed to me warranted. A whistle went. I took my place. The train pulled out. The unit I was attached to was a mixed force of Japanese and Manchukuo troops under the command of a Japanese major. We made a splendid sight, in the early D.W. Griffiths manner. The detachments marched in single file along the high banks, paced by their reflections in the water of the paddy fields. At the head of the advanced guard fluttered the banner of the rising sun. Behind us, grey and compact, the Manchukuo contingent was just entering the valley, led by a standard bearer with a yellow flag. As usual in China, bugle calls were almost incessant. The intoxicating effects of our preconceptions had not had time to wear off, and the atmosphere seemed to me pleasantly theatrical. Banditry is endemic in Manchuria. Until the Japanese came in 1931, Manchurian banditry differed in kind from most of the banditry of China proper, which was in great part a phenomenon of despair and the byproduct of civil wars, famines, floods, and plague. The typical Manchurian bandit was a racketeer, an enterprising and old-established parasite. A mile further on, we came to a bend in the track. Here were, symmetrically arranged in order of height, the entire student body from the various schools in Sinpin. They awaited our approach in silent immobility, expressing, I imagine, a tacit sympathy with our failure in the field. But I was wrong. That prelude of silence was a carefully rehearsed stage effect. As we drew level with the line, some well-intentioned cheerleaders uttered a low, urgent cry. It was answered by a deafening ovation. Hats were waved wildly in the air. Flags, hitherto concealed, were agitated to and fro. Cheer upon cheer crashed upon our unsuspecting ears at point-blank range. The effects were immediate and far-reaching. The Major's pony bolted. An orderly was bucked off into the dust. The head of the column was thrown into complete confusion. The trick worked better than ever. Mute and motionless, the carefully tapered rank of boys and girls gave the drivers no indication of what was in store for them. Not until the leading teams were well abreast did they release their pent-up gratitude. Then, with shattering effect, they once more blasted the column sideways with a salvo of cheers, frantically flapping their banners to complete the mule's alarm. A great cloud of dust rolled up above the stamping and confusion. The student body went on cheering. At the gates of the town, and all along the principal street, the crowds, though dense, were happily less demonstrative. It was here, in the courtyard outside their mess, that I saw my first bandit. He was tied to a post, a netball post to be exact. A few feet away, lashed to a smaller stake, was one of his spies, a man who, posing as a respectable citizen, had been caught sending out information to the bandits from Sinpin. They were both going to be shot that night. They were not an attractive pair. The bandit was a youth of 19. He had commanded a gang of 40 men. He was poorly dressed in peasant's clothes, and he had a large, round, moon-like face. It gave you the impression of being unnaturally swollen, and this impression was heightened by a generous black eye which embossed one cheek. The face wore an expression of surly and bestial resignation. His pig-like eyes betrayed little interest in his captors. They treated him as if he were a permanent, inanimate, and only slightly out of the ordinary fixture in their temporary home. His spy was a Caliban. He was a big, ape-like man, with a forehead villainously low and a jaw which at once jutted and sagged. He had a battered look about him, not recently acquired. His pose conveyed despair, but in his heavy bloodshot eyes, eternally scrutinizing the dust, there was only a kind of dull, incurious brooding. He was like a beast which had been too long in a trap. I photographed them both, without compunction, but not without a vague feeling of embarrassment. They had only a few more hours to live, but in the little I had seen and learned of the effects of banditry was enough to dull all pity.